Thank you all for coming. It's great to be here today. It's a real honor for me to be here. The Alabama Department of Archives and History is one of my favorite places associated with Alabama history, and I am especially thrilled to be the president of the Friends of the Alabama Archives. And I thought before I began my program I would use this as a bully pulpit to scare up membership for my organization, which does many good things for the archives. The money that we raise through the Friends organization provides databases for genealogical and historical researchers, buys equipment. The staff occasionally purchases items on eBay with money they receive through the Friends. And so if you're not a member, you need to be. It's very inexpensive. It's also a great way to give a nice gift to people, a donation as an honorary gift or even a memorial donation for someone. And I think that Sherry or some of the other staff members have the forms. We also have copies of the newsletter available out on the table as you leave, so please consider being a friend of the Alabama Archives. The staff does exceptional work, and I know this because I visit archives all over this country, including the National Archives, and you cannot find more qualified, better people than we have right here in this building. So let's support our archives. And of course, they bring you wonderful programs like mine every month. So with that speech aside, I want to talk to you today about George Stiggins, and I apologize in advance for no images. I don't have a portrait of him, and very few good images other than of his rather tedious manuscript, but I didn't think that would be very interesting, so we're going to do without PowerPoint today. As I said, we really have no likeness of George Stiggins, but I can tell you what he looked like. He was short, he was stout, he weighed about 220 pounds, and he was 5 feet 6 inches tall. You can just see him sitting on the front porch of his house, various houses he lived in South Alabama and later Macon County, telling stories, family stories, history of Alabama stories, and that's the kind of man he was. He was a man who loved history. But it's not his physique, his appearance that interests us today. What really interests me about George Stiggins is his ancestry. He was the oldest of 5 children born to a man called Joseph Stiggins and a woman named Mrs. Nancy Gray. Mrs. Gray is the interesting one to me. She was a Natchez Creek woman. Now, the Natchez Indians, I'm sure many of you know, or the remnants of them, survived a French attempt to annihilate them in 1729, and they had settled among the Creek Indians and had become members of that vast confederation of towns. Their town was called Natchez, later near the town where we think of today as Talladega. And they ultimately became very important in that Creek confederation of town, that wonderful confederation composed of Muskogee speakers, of Yuchi speakers, of Alabama Indians, but also these Natchez, and that is where Stiggins' claim to be one of the tribe comes in. Now, Mrs. Gray wasn't just any Natchez woman. She was the niece of Cheneby. Many of you may have run across Cheneby if you've read about the Creek War. Cheneby was a noted warrior and headman, and he served as an aide to Andrew Jackson during the Creek War. His son was Salakta, who also served with Andrew Jackson and sometimes serving as interpreter. Cheneby was, as it's reported, the king of the Natchez tribe. In other words, he was the headman of the Natchez. And Stiggins' own son termed his ancestor's position, and George Stiggins, as the next male heir, he was the son of the headman's sister, would have succeeded as leader of the Natchez had he decided to accept the position. But George Stiggins did not accept. He refused the responsibility to become the headman of the Natchez town when it was offered. He refused the honor and responsibility. Instead, he cast his lot with the state of Alabama rather than the Creek people. Now, had George Stiggins embraced his Indian heritage and served as the headman of the Natchez, we might not remember him at all. But he rejected his ancestry in a very tortured and a very incomplete way, and so we remember him instead for a manuscript he wrote. He becomes a historian of his people. And I think this is where the great irony of this whole story is, because he was, for the non-literate Creek and Natchez people, people of strong oral tradition, they did not write histories in the fashion of their Anglo-European neighbors, and yet George Stiggins is the one Creek who does write a history that we have that survives. And so whether he embraced or rejected the leadership of the Natchez really isn't important to us today, because he made clear in the title of his manuscript he really never could escape his birthright. He entitled it "By One of the Tribe." And I also think it's very significant that he called his manuscript history a historical narration, recalling the rich storytelling tradition of his people. Now first today I want to tell you a little bit about Stiggins and his family, his very interesting, complex family, and then a little bit about the manuscript and why I think it's important and what I'm doing with it. Now Stiggins' father, Joseph, had been a Tory during the American Revolution, and he sought refuge among the Indians during the war. He was a deerskin trader and a very educated one with a facility for language. Joseph Stiggins spoke Spanish, Muskogee, Cherokee, and Natchez, which is quite a feat in my book. His children were born in the little Natchez village of Talladega. Apparently George was born around 1788 and was reared, according to his son, rather white man-like by his English father. He also, his schooling included some Latin, and he learned to speak Spanish, which was a necessity at the time due to trade with Spanish Florida. George Stiggins also understood Muskogee and Natchez, but wasn't very fluent in either. In other words, English was his primary language. He grew up to be a farmer, although his son tells us he wasn't a very good one. We also know that he was, and I'm quoting, a periodical drinker of ardent liquor, as were many of his fellow Alabamians at the time. So that does not make him exceptional in my book. Like his uncle Chetabee, George Stiggins fought with the Americans in a conflict that split the Creek people into two warring factions in 1813-14, although his record as a soldier is undistinguished. After the war, he and his wife, as well as many of his extended family members, settled on property given to them in South Alabama by General Andrew Jackson in return for their services as allies of the Americans against the Red Stick Creeks. His neighbors were also Creeks, mostly high status and of mixed ancestry, who had likewise assisted Jackson and lived in and around the community of Tensas. Tensas, in fact, as you recall, had been the site of the outbreak of the war in 1813, when a good number of Stiggins' kin and friends were killed during an attack on the fortified homestead owned by Samuel Mims. Stiggins was on furlough, very conveniently on furlough, in Mobile the day of the attack, as were a number of his close relatives. Some were in the fort, and they were spared. What's interesting, again, in a way of family connections, is the man that led the attack, William Weatherford, would one day become Stiggins' brother-in-law. Now, Weatherford enters our story here, and he is a man of myth as much as history. And I think if we had to remember, say, what Weatherford was remembered for, three events would spring to mind. One, the attack on Fort Mims, which was viewed as an infamous attack by Americans, and it appears largely that he was involved in the planning and the direction of the attack. He was not a mere bystander, but was very involved. We also remember his defense of the fortified creekside of Holy Ground, and of course his famous surrender to Jackson at the end of the war. Now, more about those later, just a little bit. For now, let me say that Weatherford's ancestry was as impressive as Stiggins'. In fact, in the Muskogee Creek worldview, even more impressive. Now, modern male historians of Anglo-European descent like to point out that Weatherford was a member of the extended family of Alexander McGillivray. Alexander's father was Scotsman Lachlan McGillivray, one of the wealthiest loyalists in Georgia. Lachlan McGillivray left America and lost his American estate during the American Revolutionary War, but Alexander served as a British agent among the Creeks. Alexander was well educated and highly literate, and in the era after the war, he managed to forge political and economic alliances with Spanish Florida, as well as secure a peace treaty with the George Washington administration. By all counts, he was a man who impressed all who knew him. He was not only a good diplomat, but a businessman as well, and good at leading the Creeks. Now, it's the European names, McGillivray and Weatherford, and the focus on patrilineal descent, all this business about Lachlan, that obscure the fact that Weatherford was, in fact, close kin of Alexander McGillivray. They had a common ancestor, a Coasati Creek woman known as Sehoy, a member of the Wind clan, arguably the most powerful clan of the Creek Confederacy. Alexander McGillivray and William Weatherford shared a grandmother, but different fathers, Scottish fathers. The fathers are immaterial because they were both powerful and important Creek men and were, in the Creek matrilineal way of reckoning kin, uncle and nephew, the strongest imaginable bond, the closest kinship possible. And I won't belabor Creek kinship and its significance here, except to say that George Stiggins and part of his family fought with Jackson. Weatherford fought against them, but they were both from leading and highly influential Creek families. And we might also parse that out a little bit and say it's more than likely that McGillivray was an Alabama Creek, so they're not Muscogan Creeks. Now, after the war, Stiggins and Weatherford both retired to South Alabama, accumulating, like most of their extended families, land and slaves, African slaves. They became planters. Weatherford died in 1824 on his plantation just a few miles north of the site of Fort Mims. In the 1830s, the Creek Indians were forcibly removed from the state of Alabama. Weatherford's kin were not. They continued to live in and around Tensas, powerful local elites, unremarkable except for their remarkable ancestry and their wealth. After his death, Weatherford's descendants, including members of the Stiggins family, had a nice little fight about family property and sued each other over the family's African slaves. It was a nasty little business, and the case book is right here in the archives, detailing all the testimony over the case, which was heard in the Alabama Supreme Court. Now, the case hinged upon whether or not the eldest son of William Weatherford had been legitimate. The eldest son, Weatherford's child by an Indian woman, was raised by Weatherford and his second wife, Mary, and this is the woman, Mary, who is the sister of George Stiggins. But at Weatherford's death, Mary's family, i.e. the Stiggins side of the family, denied that the eldest son had any right to Weatherford property. Court records document the exacting manner, and almost humorous manner at times, in which Alabama lawyers worked to argue what exactly constituted a legal marriage among Creek Indians in a time of war, as if that might make a difference, and whether or not such a marriage, even if it were legitimate among the Creeks, could be valid under Alabama law in the 1850s. I'm sure they were ringing up the billable hours as they were doing all this. Now, by this time, George Stiggins was dead, and his legacy was not a parcel of slaves, but an incomplete legacy, an incomplete history of his people. His son would later write that in his last illness, he expressed much regret at not being able to finish the history, being the part with which he was most familiar, or in the part which immediately came under his own personal observation. Stiggins died, his history unfinished, in November 1845, and I must say, every time I get to the end of that incomplete manuscript, which ends, I will now turn my attention to the seat of the war among the Upper Creeks, I nearly cry, because it's a good lesson in procrastination for all of us. If you have something you want to write down, do it now before you go to your great reward. Okay, so that's a little background on Stiggins and his very interesting family, and you can imagine Sunday dinners with the Weatherfords and the Stiggins family. All the way there are conflicts, although I think they were a very close family when they weren't trying to kill each other or arguing about the family slaves. That does come through, a remarkable camaraderie between Stiggins and Weatherford, whom he admired. So what about this history then, this incomplete history? What it is a written account of the history of the Creek people and the place of the Natchez Indians in the Confederacy from the point of view of someone who is intimately connected with the events of the early 19th century. Now, it's a very rare thing, and I think it's a very important thing, because the Creeks were not a literate people, and the narrative was not only written for a number of purposes, but it provides us a unique view into a unique opportunity to see what the Creek view of things would be. But the view is that of an accommodating, acculturated, literate Christian farmer, not the other side, which was quite different. So it is a skewed viewpoint of Creek history, but it still offers valuable insights into Creek views. In short, it is a history by a man who had seemingly rejected his Indian heritage and responsibilities, who left his tribal people, and who, along with his sisters and other members of his complex family, petitioned to become legal citizens of the state of Alabama. George's son Joseph explained his father's choices. He later wrote in a letter after his father died that his father was white. His aunts married white men. He married a white woman. He felt the whites were his people. But let us not suppose, the son continued, that he was void of sympathy for his unfortunate but misguided countrymen, as Stiggins himself put it, my woe-worn and pitiable country. And what is telling to me is the language in which the son writes. Race had become a factor in all this by the early 19th century. Race, white, white, white versus Indian. It hadn't been that important in the period before the war. And so the Stiggins family made a decision that to succeed, they had to choose which race they were going to become in a state that was rapidly becoming biracial instead of triracial, and in which there was a dominant race which would impose restrictions on others. And so that explains for me a lot of their choices. George Stiggins fought with the white people in the Creek Civil War, and in the 1830s, he was one of the ones who assisted in framing the treaty with the American government that dissolved Creek government in the East and ultimately forced their removal to the West. It made him feel badly, his son wrote, that the Natchez Creeks forgave him for taking up arms against them and were willing to recognize him as their legitimate leader. Even after the treaty, he came back and the chief sat before him and said, you know, you're next in line, it's your office. And George Stiggins rejected that. Now, what's interesting to me is the Natchez position, because for them, the actions of George Stiggins didn't matter. What was important to them was clan connection and kinship. Those were the things that mattered. Stiggins had a choice, and to him, race mattered more than kin and family, which tells us a lot about the choices that Indians were faced with in the early part of the 19th century. Perhaps, I think more than anything else, simply writing the history shows how far George Stiggins strayed from the tradition of his native culture, which was an oral culture. Now, I know that everyone in Alabama loves to hear about William Weatherford, and for good reason. And to me, one of the most important or interesting aspects of the narrative deal with Weatherford, one of those misguided countrymen and an unreconstructed rebel, if ever there was one. Now, in his surrender to Andrewson, Stiggins wrote that Weatherford was unrepentant, saying that he would have continued to fight if it had been possible to reanimate his lifeless warriors. In other words, he says he surrendered only because his warriors were dead, the women and children who were left were starving, their towns were burned, their power was broken, his life was over. He turned himself in to accept what he expected as a warrior's fate, execution, on condition that the surviving women and children be fed. But as we know, he was not executed, and he was not held accountable for leading the attack on Fort Mims. Of all the individuals who the United States would have liked to have strung up, one would have thought that Weatherford would have been at the top of the list. Very few Red Stick leaders escaped execution, either by the Americans or usually at the hands of Creeks, who did it to appease Americans. So here we have the man who bloodied his hands at Fort Mims, who was vilified, who was the Zarqawi of his day, if we want to call him that, or the Osama bin Laden of his day. I hate to put him in that sort of thing, but he was the enemy. He was the bad guy, and yet he walks away. Instead, we celebrate Weatherford's wartime exploits. Now, how do we get to this flip-flop? How do we get from savage, murderer to someone who is widely admired and held in higher esteem? Well, Stiggins storytelling is one reason. Telling the story from the point of view of Weatherford, putting the cards on the table as to what his motives were, and making him sympathetic. The most popular Weatherford stories debate the details of that famous leap off a high cliff in a hail of American bullets, but they do celebrate his masculinity, his bravery, his heroism, and that's what Weatherford is celebrated for. Not the side he was on, but his personal characteristics, which Stiggins played up in his narrative. Weatherford is now noble in defeat. His bravery and honor at the time of surrender are celebrated. His willingness to sacrifice himself for the women and children. All these things transformed him into a noble and endearing figure for Alabamians. Now, in time, The Creeks, I think, took longer than Alabamians, but he was forgiven for the atrocities they associated with his name, and instead it's the man himself and his characteristics, his athleticism, his nobility, those kinds of things that are celebrated. And we might conclude that Stiggins' stories, which attempted to explain Weatherford's participation and celebrate his manly virtues, had much to do with his reconstruction of the Weatherford image and the acceptance of the defeated and dispirited Red Stick Creeks. But the narration is much more than that. It is rambling, but in it one can find incredible insights on the organization of Creek town government, social and political relationships among Creek towns, religious practices, as well as details about the Creek War from an insider's point of view, from someone who had heard it from the Red Stick survivors. And I think when I read the thing, what really strikes me is the tension that comes through between the leaders of the Red Stick movement over policy, over procedure, over military affairs, and he gives a hint as to the tensions going on there. So it really is a very interesting and important history for Alabama. Now, what about the manuscript itself? Well, it has a 3-page introduction, and it's 85 pages of text written in longhand on lined paper. It has virtually no paragraphs and no periods. It is almost 1 or 2 long sentences. But boy, could Stiggins turn a phrase. He really could. Where is it? It's not here. The Yankees got it. It's at the Wisconsin Historical Society, in very good hands, I might add. There are wonderful people there as part of the Lyman Draper collection. Lyman Draper was an early document collector, and he came through Alabama with money at a time when people needed it and managed to buy it from the Stiggins family. There is also included in all that another narrative by another member of the Stiggins clan network who had married a sister of Weatherford, and so that's where it is. Now, by the time Draper came through Alabama and purchased the manuscript and made a lot of Alabamians really mad at him, it was already famous in part of the historical canon. Joining Albert Pickett's History of Alabama, which was published in 1851, and Woodward's Reminiscences, which was originally published as a series of letters to the editors of the Montgomery Daily Mail, which actually was an extended critique, an uncomplimentary critique of Pickett's history. The Creek War is central to all 3 works: Pickett's History, Woodward's Reminiscences, and of course Stiggins' narrative. In the late 19th century, as Alabama recovered from Civil War and Reconstruction and began to build its archives, efforts were made to locate the famous document. People knew about it, knew Pickett had consulted it, it was on the lips, but where was it? Now, when they first contacted the Wisconsin Historical Society, those folks denied they had it. And they weren't being shifty. They just couldn't find it. They really didn't. Draper's papers were in such a mess. But eventually, in 1897, it was found, and Alabama employed a lady to copy the thing out in longhand, all 156 pages of it. She charged $34.20 for doing it, and very promptly noted that she had followed the manuscript exactly in manner, also in punctuation, which is faulty. Amen to that. But in other words, she really tried her best to give a good copy in that age before electronic copies were available. Now, the transcript of the manuscript arrived in Alabama on April 27, 1901, and plans were immediately made to publish the document. Dr. William Stokes Wyman, who was president of the University of Alabama and a Latin scholar with an interest in Indian history, was the man entrusted with the task of preparing this document for publication. He dutifully copied the document for a printer, wrote an introduction, and provided some annotations. And he noted in his introduction, "I have preferred to leave the text as I found it, bad spelling, bad grammar, and all. I have corrected only a few obvious mistakes of the copyist and altered the punctuation so as to make the content clear and intelligible to the reader." But for reasons that are not clear, Wyman's version of the manuscript was never published. Instead, along with the copy, it has been read by generations of readers here at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. Eventually, the Wisconsin Historical Society did microfilm the document and make it available to scholars, but microfilm is, the collection is very expensive and it's not widely available except to scholars. And in 1958, the thing finally appeared in print over 3 issues of the scholarly journal Ethnohistory, and making it, I might add, a nightmare to cite over those 3 journal issues. The editor of that version put square brackets all over the thing, adding periods and commas and doing the best he could to break it up, and it looks like barbed wire all through the thing, but he was struggling with it. The most widely available version was published finally in 1989 when the Birmingham Public Library Press published a version edited by Virginia Pounds Brown. Now, Mrs. Brown's version is interesting in a number of ways. First, she used as the base for her manuscript the work of Dr. Wyman, which by that time was almost 100 years old, so that's interesting that she chose to do that. But she did compare that version to the original manuscript. She kept Wyman's annotations, she added a small number, but her main effort was directed at tidying up the text, and she has my sympathy with that. And I'm quoting her. She said, "Basic editing was done to the frequently obscure and wordy manuscript in the interest of clarity and readability. This involved, on her part, recasting sentences, adding punctuation, standardizing all spellings of tribal, town, and proper names, as well as breaking up the text by supplying headings." Now, she produced a wonderful little book that's great to read, and if you had a choice between all the versions you would want to read, you would choose her version. But from a scholarly viewpoint, it's seriously flawed. Because for one thing, it's not nice to change people's spellings. That reveals pronunciation. It reveals all kinds of interesting things. Even the way people write a sentence can be used by scholars to do a literary analysis and things. So it's very important from a scholarly perspective to keep the document as completely like it was. Now, this is where I come in. I am now working on a new transcription of the document, which, as I say, is about 6 long sentences over these 100 or so pages. And before you get the idea that it's not a really interesting thing to read, or that it's wordy, obscure, those kind of things I've just used, it's nothing like that at all. It's a very interesting document, but it is one that you can't find a good place to stop because it's just one big sentence. And so the problem becomes for a historical editor, how do you maintain the integrity of the original and yet provide something that scholars can cite and that everyday people with an interest in the topic can read and enjoy and understand? And so that's what we're struggling with now. And along the way, talking with my colleague Greg Wasilkoff at the University of South Alabama, I'm sure many of you know him, and certainly will want to get his new book out on Fort Mims, which is due out soon. If it's not already available, I'm not sure if it's available just now, but it will be soon. And we decided that we had many other documents relating to the Creek War, many of them right here in the archives, and that maybe time had come, instead of people reading Pickett for history about the Creek War, maybe it's time for Alabamians to read the documents themselves and to present the documents to people in a way that challenged folks to think about what documents mean and how history is written. So our new edition of Stiggins will be, Stiggins will just be part of it. In other words, the monster has grown, and we're including documents from the beginning of the war to the end, and Stiggins will be right at the end, his almost reminiscence type narrative about the Creek War. Many of our documents will come from the Department of Archives and History here. We recognize this will be valuable to scholars, but we really hope that the edition will be welcomed by all interested Alabamians who will finally have at their fingertips some of the manuscripts that Pickett himself used, as well as many others. I'm looking at things like pension records of American soldiers who were injured at Horseshoe Bend. That provides all kinds of information on weaponry, on fighting that went on, and those kinds of things. Those have never really been used by anyone before. Most of our documents are directly from the period of the Creek War. They're first-hand reports and communications. As such, many of them turn out later to be inaccurate. And so we'll challenge readers to think about what on-the-spot documents do and their limitations. Some of the reports are by participants written after the action, in some cases months or even years later, upon prodding by Pickett, who said, "Hey, do you remember what happened?" And they would write their they would write back to him. So our aim in the introduction will be to engage our readers to consider not only the complexity of the war, but the complexity of the motives that produced documents about it. We will call on readers to consider the many Alabama voices that speak, from nativist Red Sticks to accommodationist Creeks to those of Americans who call for the extinction of the Creek Indians as a people. It's a messy, messy business, the Creek War, and it's sometimes very difficult to read the documents, frankly. We are sensitive to issues of race and class and religion and how these issues shaped perceptions and memories of the participants and how it shaped their construction of documents about it. We also hope to include statements by modern Creek people on the significance of the documents to them and for their history. And along the way, we're struggling to achieve an editorial method that will produce authoritative versions of the documents. In the 19th century, Stiggins isn't the only one who didn't standardize his spelling or use periods and commas as we might wish he would have. So finding a consistent way to present the documents so that modern audiences will understand what they're reading without at the same time altering them in a way that will affect their meaning is very important to us. My personal goal is to free Stiggins from the fetters of grammatical correctness and bracketed punctuation. I just hate looking at that. So that his very rollicking freestyle prose, and he was a very eloquent man. I'm sure he was a heck of a storyteller because it comes through in his writing. And I think once we get this out, Stiggins will be restored to his proper place in the major books on Alabama history. And my hope, more importantly, is that the documents of the dominant literate culture will more fully reveal the complex story of the non-literate Creek people about whom they are writing. And I want to stop here. I have some of Stiggins, I can read him, but I thought it probably would be more fun if you had questions that I could just answer your questions. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, ma'am. I think what I decided. Oh, thank you for reminding me to do that. The question was, what things were changed in my mind as I read Stiggins? And I think for me, and it took many readings for this to happen, but it finally dawned on me what he was saying about as he recounted the activities of the other side of the Red Stick Creeks. Now, he's not there. He's telling this as a repeated story from probably Weatherford and others who were there, but conflicts and arguments about the proper course of action, how they were going to launch the attack, what was the best way to do it, those kinds of things. So you get a little insight in the Creek warrior councils, as it were. And it took me a long time to really understand what he was saying, because it is, it gets long and sort of draggy in there, and I was all caught up with the relationship about towns and so forth. But I think, to me, that's one of the most significant parts of the account. It gives you about as close as we're going to get as to what was going on the other side, and none of those people left any sort of records at all, and most of them are dead by the end of the war. So it's a skewed account. It's a memory. And probably chopped and changed along the way a little bit, but at least it's a glimpse, a little bit of insight into what the other side was thinking at certain times. Mm-hmm. He does mention Francis. He doesn't mention him a great deal. He tends to, and part of the reason, I think, is that he is trying to, dare I say it, distance Weatherford from some of the fanatical chiefs. And so there's that element which has to be taken into account in the annotations. And I didn't repeat your question, but you had two. the question is, in case you didn't hear, Pickett talks about Weatherford's reluctance to talk about Fort Mims because of the women and children, and what does Stiggins say about that? Stiggins and the other narrative by the member of his family try to distance Weatherford from the slaughter, saying that, you know, once it was over, the fort was gained, Weatherford goes. And I'll leave it to you to decide why a warrior would leave at that point. The idea is, in his nobility, he had a military objective, and that he was a disavowing method of warfare. It may be true, but on the other hand, there's also the idea that Stiggins is attempting to rehabilitate the reputation of his brother-in-law and his family member. So there's some of that, but Weatherford did leave, and he went to the plantation of his family and gathered up their slaves and took them to the Creek Nation and kept them during the war so that they would not be captured. In other words, he went off to see about family property. So he did have other business elsewhere. And members of the extended family network, many of the women who had married white men, they were taken captive. They weren't killed, although a few, you know, were. So does that answer that question? Maybe so. Yes, sir. We can. And while I find them, I'll answer other questions. How many subgroups were there in the Creek Nation? Well, it depends on who you ask. And I'm being facetious in a way, but the real answer is there are two. There are the Muskogee speakers, and then there are the ones they term the stinkers, the people who don't speak Muskogee, and that's everybody else, including the Alabama. One of the most interesting things about the Creek Confederation, and as we study other Indian tribes a little more fully, we realize that the Creeks are not unique in this, but they certainly perfected it. And that is, they were very good at accepting remnant peoples into their confederacy, and they had a very specific way of doing it. And the Natchez example is a good one. There are also Shawnee. There's a Shawnee town, Sylacauga. There are several Shawnee little villages, and Tuckabatchee frequently gets lumped into that, but Tuckabatchee is a Muskogee Creek town. The Chickasaw had a town called the Breed Camp, as well as, I think, Apacuchee, which is another town, was probably mainly Chickasaw. There are Apalachicolas who come up there, Hitchites. There are all sorts of Indian peoples who, for one reason or another, usually because Europeans have been waging war against them and destroying them, come into the Creek Nation, and they make an agreement with the Creek Indians. And the agreement is this: they give over their right to conduct independent foreign policy to the way that all the Creek towns did that. They can have their own social customs and laws within their towns, as the Yuchi did. They speak their own language there, but in the general run of things, the Creek is the majority language. So you have interesting things happening. For instance, in the Yuchi town, most all the women and children speak Yuchi, and the men speak Yuchi, but they mainly deal in Creek when they're dealing with other Creek towns. The same with the Natchez. The Natchez women, almost all of them spoke Natchez, but not Muskogee Creek. And so that, when you start counting all these little bits, you can basically say that they're the Muskogee Creeks, and then there are all these other tribes. But then if you start really boiling it down, you can get many more divisions. But that's the simple answer, I suppose. And I think if you listen to Stiggins and what he's trying to say, he's saying, my heritage is from the Natchez Creek and from this Creek town of Natchez, and I am one of the tribe. I am a Creek Indian. And I think the proper answer, rather than the facetious one, is to say there's only one kind of Creek Indian in that worldview, and that is anyone who lives in that Creek Nation and calls himself a Creek and abides by the laws and so forth. So, other questions? Yes. Well, he is supposedly buried there, and people have said that for a long time, so I have no doubt he is. I am not a real scholar of cemeteries and graveyards, other than to say a lot of people are buried in unmarked graves, and I have hunted for quite a few, and I think it's interesting. At least we know approximately where he's buried. In some cases, I think the tombstones were made of wood and just decayed before stone monuments were placed, but it's very, very common not to have, be able to find markers. I don't know that says anything about his social status. I don't think his family was doing all that well by the time, but I won't read anything into that about financial affairs or things like that, because I don't know how common or uncommon that was for the people in the community to use those sort of things. And I have not been out to the church, but there is a historic marker there. Yes. Yes. Yes, his is very well marked, with almost as big as the Washington Monument down, and very well marked. I think the state, somebody here with the archives probably know better than me, who one of the early historical groups, I think, put a big marker up to honor Weatherford, who's buried near his mother. Yes. Yes. Am I familiar with a book published in the 1970s or 80s about horseshoe bend by two authors? No. It's is it the one? Is it a little pamphlet type big book? Oh, okay, novel. Right. Okay. Right. Well, I have to make a confession. I stay away from fiction about. I love fiction, but when it's dealing with the people I work with in a historical sense, I just can't bring myself to read it. And I know there was another one recently, and I don't know. I find it it makes me uneasy, because by the very nature, historians are restricted in what they can do with the evidence, and you can push and pull it so much, and boy, I do that. But you can't make stuff up, and you can't create dialogue and conversation, and the whole point of being a novelist is you have to be freed from those kinds of restrictions and use imagination, and I love good novels, but I just can't do it. I just can't read them and enjoy them when they're about people that I work so hard to maintain some sort of integrity for the sources. So that's probably why I have not read that book or any of the other novels about the Creek people. Pickett's history is very exceptional for its time and place. He does make some mistakes. He does have a certain point of view that comes through, but for what it is, it's very good. He doesn't tell the entire story, and his understanding of certain events is limited, but he was very intent on telling a good story, and he was guided by the sources he had. So it's a good starting place, but it isn't something that we should take literally and not question. Yes, I believe it was, and we all honor it as a great Alabama history, and it really is outstanding for its time. So is the book, which I was trying to work out, the book by Halbert and Ball, called The Creek War, which very, very good. Henry, Halbert, I believe, and Ball's first name is, somebody's going to help me with that? It'll come to me eventually. the Creek War, I think it's called, and it really details events at the beginning of the war. And this is what's so annoying to me as someone who really likes to focus on the Tallapoosa region and Horseshoe Bend. Stiggins died before he talked about that part of the war. This is where all the Natchez were fighting. This is where Andrew Jackson was. This is where he really could have been some assistance, and I just get mad at him for not doing it before he died. But many of the participants did the same thing, and so our sense of the Creek War, my feeling is our whole sense of the Creek War is skewed by this emphasis on Mims and the Alabama River campaigns, and then all of a sudden there are a few little battles and the Mississippians and the Georgians come in, and then Andrew Jackson wraps it all up. And there's a lot more there, and that's one thing that we're really fettered by, and that is the lack of good sources from both sides, and a lack of sensitive sources. The difference between sources that Americans write about the creeks in the 19th century and the British wrote in the 18th century is like night and day as far as sensitivity to tribal divisions, leadership, and all that sort of thing. The Americans wrote they wrote reports, and they were the hostiles, and they were over there, and we're going to go get them. And you know, it just doesn't provide a lot of details. They don't provide the intelligence they're getting, and they were getting some. They had spies out everywhere. They had people like Cheneby who's feeding them information, but a lot of that has not survived or didn't make it into official reports. What they're interested in is getting the supplies down, getting the army in place, and getting, you know, as Andrew Jackson's favorite word, exterminating the Indians, exterminating the hostiles, determining to exterminate them. I mean, that's on their mind, and they don't care about political division of the enemy or anything else. They only care about numbers and where they are and getting them. And so it makes it very difficult to try to tease out the other side's wartime activities in that very short space of time where they were basically hiding from the Americans or fortifying themselves in certain locations, and that's a strain for historians to deal with. One more question, and then I promise I'll read a passage. And if you have to go to work, I know it's a lunchtime thing, I won't be offended if you leave. One more question. Anybody? Yes. The question is there any evidence regarding any, I think I'm understanding you correct, collusion between Weatherford and the American government to get rid of squatters? No. Well, the Americans were looking for an excuse. There's no doubt about that. They were aimed and they were loaded and aimed and ready to go, and that was all they needed. But no, it's much more complex than that, and it has specifically Creek motives. And I'm going to refer you to the new book by Greg Wasselkoff called, I believe his title is An Unconquered Spirit. The University of Alabama Press will have it out soon, on Fort Mims, the lead up to the battle and the aftermath. And he lists people who died there and why they were there and the tensions and conflicts. So he will be the last word for a very long time on Fort Mims. And he's an outstanding scholar, and so I recommend that book to you for that. Greg Wasselkoff, W-A-S-E-L-K-O-V. Yes. Big warrior, yes. Minowa, not very much. And I think that was waiting for the second part, the part he didn't write, when he says, we'll now turn our attention to the conflict in the upper towns. But he does mention quite a few people, and quite a few people that will be unknown to most of us. All right. I'm getting the nod, so feel free to get up and leave, or if you'd like to stay and continue asking questions, I can stay for a few more minutes. Oh, Reed. How about I conclude with George Stiggins, and this is from Virginia Pounds Brown, her cleaned up version of Weatherford leaping off the bluff, I think. Yes, I believe it was true. Too many people have lied about it otherwise. If not, there's so many. Okay, this is what he says. After the defection and total desertion of Francis and his followers, it was the reinforcement and runaway Negroes that had to sustain the battle in a retreating fight. They were earnestly fighting to check the whites until the town women and children could hide some of their stuff and make their escape. And this is another important thing, the alliance of Africans, blacks, mainly escaped slaves or slaves who had been captured fighting with the Red Sticks, which is one reason the Americans were fighting real hard. A runner came to them and told them that they were about to be surrounded by a squadron of horsemen and foot soldiers who were trying to close their lines on the rear of the town. They all quickly retreated, some to save themselves, others to their horses, to try to escape at an open space of ground where the lines were not yet closed. The Indians and Negroes, being mostly afoot, saved themselves by swimming over the river. John Moniac and 2 others went through before the lines were closed. Weatherford and McPherson on horses viewed the lines to see if there was any gap that would permit their escape. They found it all closed. They were unable to fight, but they preferred death to surrender or being prisoners to an army. The only avenue left for them to escape was a leap off a bluff between 50 and 60 feet high. I will say other sources say it was about 10 feet, but that's not as quite. But maybe it was that high. At the junction of a creek and a river, Weatherford was mounted on a swift and mettlesome corsair. Abonair was the horse's name, who in part belonged to Benjamin Baldwin of Macon County. Weatherford knew the horse's mettle and docile disposition to the will of the rider, and that he would not fly aside from any direction given him, especially if urged on by the spur. Weatherford proposed taking the first leap from the bluff. He rode his horse up to the margin and let him see it, then reined him in nearly 30 yards, rifle in hand, then struck off the bluff and touched the horse with a spur. The generous beast leapt off as though he meant to reach the opposite shore. Weatherford said he seemed to go straight forward for more than 30 feet, then turned nearly head down and kept a curving flight until he struck the water. Man and horse separated long before they touched the water. Then they swam ashore together, gun and all unhurt. When he reached the shore, Weatherford saw his flight repeated by McPherson. He said it was awfully curious to see a man and horse fly through the air like a cormorant or fish eagle when he pounces on a fish. Both got to the shore unhurt, and with their friends who swam the river, bore the news of the destruction of the holy ground town wherever they went. And that is the kind of writing that Stiggins is capable of doing. Thank you. And don't forget your card so you can become a friend of the Alabama Archives.